kind. So in other words, they have a volition that they want to be kind, and their kindness, their desire to be kind makes, wins out. This is familiar. This is a debate in philosophy. Should acting morally be difficult? On the one hand, people say yes, it should, because the reason why we value morality is because it's a struggle. It's like winning out. Compare it with being brave. If you don't feel fear, then you're not really brave. A bomb diffusing robot is not brave in diffusing a bomb because it doesn't feel fear. Whereas a human diffusing a bomb who's terrified, they're brave because they're overcoming their fear. By analogy, you have to find doing the right thing hard for your moral action to be worthwhile, for it to be truly moral. So say some theorists. But against that, look at the idea of a moral saint. A moral saint is somebody who the idea of doing wrong never occurs to them. They just want to do the right thing, and they always do it, and they're happy to do it, and they find it easy. Isn't that a possibility? Well, Frankfurt is saying, sure, some people are just constructed, they're the lucky ones, that their volitions and their will coincide. And he says, the enjoyment of freedom comes easily to some, those kind of people. Others must struggle to achieve it, like the unwilling addict. Okay, final points. What have we talked about? Everything? Oh, yes. Now, we get to a very key point, talking about moral responsibility. He says, it is generally supposed that in addition to satisfying the two conditions I have mentioned, the two advantages, a satisfactory theory of the freedom of the will necessarily provides an analysis of one of the conditions of moral responsibility. This is on page 18. Now, I don't know about you, but reading this, Frankfurt got a bit confusing. And I think the problem is he uses the term freedom of the will and will to be free. And he uses them differently. So he says, let's just read the passage that he says. First of all, he says, freedom is separate. He said this on page 18. It is generally supposed that in blah, blah, blah. The most common recent approach to the problem of understanding the freedom of the will has been indeed to inquire what is entailed by the assumption that someone is morally responsible. So in other words, in order to work out what freedom of the will is, people say, well, we know what it is to be morally responsible, and you can only be morally responsible if you're free. So by looking at cases where we hold people morally responsible, that'll tell us what freedom of the will is. And Frankfurt says that's wrong. In my view, however, the relation between moral responsibility and the freedom of the will has been very widely misunderstood. It is not true that a person is morally responsible for what he has done only if his will was free when he did it. Now, you might think when he says will was free, that he's talking about his account of freedom of the will. It doesn't seem to be the case that he's doing that here, because he says a person's will is free only if he is free to have the will he wants. Okay, that sounds a bit like, because when you do have freedom of the will in his account, it's when your volition, the first order desire that your volition wants to be your will actually is your will. But here he introduces this idea of could have done otherwise. He says that this means that with regard to any of his first order desires, he is free either to make that desire his will or to make some other first order desire his will instead. In other words, he's saying what most people talk about when they say a person's will is free is that your volition is free. You could have had a different volition. And he says that's something over and above what he calls freedom of the will. So what he calls freedom of the will, as he says right at the end, is entirely compatible with determinism. You know, you could be determined to have your second order desire that I want to, my desire to refrain from eating the donut. You were determined to have a second order desire that first order desire win out, and it did. That's entirely consistent with determinism. That's why he's a compatibilist. You could have that. And you can be morally responsible if that happens. But what you might lack is the kind of thing that a libertarian demands, that you could have done otherwise, that you could have had a different volition. You could have had a different volition. He says, I don't care about that. I don't care if you could have had a different volition. And in fact, so this ties back to what I was talking about, the Mr. Black example, where you kill Mr. Pink, and even though you couldn't have done otherwise, you're morally responsible. And he gives another example of a willing addict. This is like the Mr. Black case. The willing addict is someone who wants his desire to take a drug to win out. So he wants to want the drug, and he wants his desire for the drug to be successful. Now, it turns out that if he wanted otherwise, he would still have taken the drug. So he's taking the drug whatever happens. Suppose he's just like the unwilling addict. In other words, the unwilling addict ends up taking the drug even though he doesn't want it, except that he wants it. But if he didn't want it, he'd be the unwilling addict, because whatever happens, he's taking the drug. The first order desire to take the drug is so powerful that it doesn't matter what his second order desires are, it's going to win. It just so happens that his second order desires agree. Now, could he have done otherwise? No, he couldn't have done otherwise than what he does, than taking the drug. But despite the fact that he couldn't have done otherwise, he is morally responsible. So what Frankfurt is saying is, when people talk about this freedom of the will, when other people talk about, how does he put it, acting out of, at the end of page 18 where he says, a person's will is free. When other people talk about a person's will being free, they mean something different from what I mean by freedom of the will. They mean something on top of that they could have had a different volition, or that if their volition had been that another desire win out, then that desire would have won out. But that, of course, isn't satisfied here, because if the willing addict actually had a volition that he not take the drug, then he would have failed, because he's going to take the drug. So he doesn't meet this criterion of he could have done otherwise. He's always going to take the drug because his addiction is so strong. Yet, says Frankfurt, he is morally responsible. We can blame him for taking the drug because he had a volition to take the drug. We don't blame the unwilling addict for taking the drug because his volition was not to take the drug. We should assess them according to their volitions, according to their will, not their action. And the will of the willing addict is to take the drug, so we can hold him responsible because he was doing what he wanted to do. So that's his discussion at the end. Moral responsibility, therefore, doesn't require that you could have done otherwise, because freedom of to summarize, Harry Frankfurt is a compatibilist, but he's a more sophisticated compatibilist than classic compatibilists like Locke, Hume, even John Stuart Mill. These are all compatibilists who say that the freedom that matters is freedom of action. In response, libertarians say, no, that's not good enough, because freedom of action is something that animals have. And what Frankfurt does, he says, you're right. Freedom of action is not enough. I'm going to give you a notion of freedom of the will, though, that unlike libertarians doesn't involve this weird undetermined will, whatever it is that Kant is talking about. It's a perfectly down-to-earth notion where will is a desire. We understand how actions are caused by desires. We just introduced this notion of second order, and this idea of second order explains what is valuable about a person. Persons are potentially moral agents who can be held, who can act freely or fail to act freely. The wanton addict fails to act freely kind of because he's incapable of it. The unwilling addict fails to act freely because in this one instance, his desires overrode him. But he has this ability to have second-order volitions. That means in some cases he will be able to act freely. The wanton addict just can't have this freedom of the will because it requires having volitions. So, what Frankfurt has done here is come up with a more sophisticated notion, a notion of freedom of the will that is nonetheless entirely compatible with determinism. It's a modern compatibilism that goes one step beyond classic compatibilism and avoids some of the criticisms of classic compatibilism that libertarians and hard determinists have come up with. There you go.